Welcome to this video lecture, Understanding Project Management, a Practical Guide, second edition. This is chapter 14, Project Procurement. So returning to our project lifecycle, there are certain types of projects where some of the outcomes of the project, the deliverables are constructed or developed outside of the project team by another organization. For those types of projects that involve that, there are activities that fall under the umbrella of project procurement. So this is chapter 14 that we will be talking about. Now notice how it spans multiple phases. It's not combined to a single phase, and it can run throughout the project. So that's why it's represented as follows. So our agenda are the following four items. First, we will talk about something called the make or buy analysis. Then we will talk about and study defining the procurement. Next, choosing the seller, and then finally monitoring the seller's performance. Okay, so now in an introduction to project procurement, during many projects, some portion of the work is performed by another organization. It may be a small portion, or it may be a very large portion. It could be almost all of the project is performed by another organization. So these are projects that involve the concepts of project procurement. There are many terms that are used to describe this work, which can include outsourcing, purchasing, and procurement. So it can be referred to in many ways. The terminology that is used and will be used in this video lecture will be of the buyer and the seller. Okay, the buyer is the host organization that is purchasing the work, and they will receive it in the end. The seller is the one that produces the work and as the name implies, sells it to the buyer as part of the procurement process. And from a high level, the procurement process consists of the following steps. First is the decision of whether to procure or not, and that is accomplished through a make or buy analysis, which we will discuss. Then we have the definition of the procurement, which is documented in the statement of work and the RFP, or request for proposal. We'll talk more about that. There is the choosing or selection of the seller that results in a contract being produced. And then there is the monitoring of the seller's performance as the seller actually does the work as defined in the contract. The buyer monitors the seller's performance. The result being in a successful project is that the deliverables are complete and delivered. So that is the procurement process, and we'll be running through that in this lesson. So first of all, the make or buy analysis. For many projects, the decision of whether to produce certain deliverables internally or externally is obvious. It might be the type of project that the organization always does. It's their main work that they do. And so in that case, it would be an obvious make that they would do it themselves. There's others that are an obvious buy. It might be for the type of work that the organization does not have expertise in or does not do, and that would be obvious. So in some cases, make or buy is not needed. However, for some projects, it may not be obvious. There might be certain types of projects where the organization could do it themselves or could procure it from another organization. There might be a part of the project that they, again, could do themselves, but may outsource for a variety of reasons. So that's where make or buy analysis comes in. So in those cases, the completion of a make or buy analysis is required. So with that, let's go to our video of our case study video, and we'll see how a make or buy analysis is implemented. So let's watch this together.
Early in the planning phase, Sophie reviews the work breakdown structure of the project. As usual, time is limited and resources are scarce. So if there are any opportunities to outsource any of the work, now is the time to consider the options. Most of the deliverables are typical of the work performed by Deco Productions and therefore will be produced internally. However, two deliverables catch Sophie's eye: the multimedia demo and social media. Both could potentially be performed externally, so further analysis is required. Sophie first considers the multimedia demo. Enlisting help from her project team, the following analysis is completed. After further consideration and discussion with the project sponsor, the decision was made to outsource the production of the multimedia demo, despite the higher cost. The risk that Chris may be pulled onto another project was too high to ignore. Next, Sophie considers the social media deliverable. After consulting with the project sponsor, Sophie decided that the social media work will not be outsourced and will remain with the project team. The risk of an external company producing lower quality social media posts was unacceptable to Sophie.
Okay, so we saw an example of make or buy analysis in the project. So in that video, Sophie, the PM, identifies two deliverables that could potentially be outsourced using project procurement. Again, this is based on the expert judgment and considerations of the project manager, the team, and the norms within the organization. So a make or buy analysis, as we saw, was performed for each. We saw that one is approved or was approved for procurement, the multimedia demo, and the other was not approved. And you would have noticed in that video that there was various criteria that was decided, that they looked at cost, they looked at the scope, and they looked at the risk. So they had various ways of measuring the different aspects of both performing it internally, make, or procuring it externally, buy. And so they came up with two different solutions in this case. So and you can see the two make or buy analysis documents for the case study in the textbook, chapter 14. So key idea, a make or buy analysis is used to determine whether the work of a project should be produced internally by the project team, make, or by an external organization, buy. Okay, our next step in our process is defining the procurement. Once the project procurement decision has been made, the next challenge is to define the characteristics of the procurement. So we need to define what it is we want an external organization to produce for us. We need to be able to document that, because the external organization cannot know otherwise. They cannot somehow read our minds or deduce what we might need. We have to explicitly tell them in terms of our procurement requirements. And this consists of creating two main documents. The statement of work describes the work to be completed, the details of the deliverables and so on, how they work, what their characteristics are, what their performance metrics should be, and so on. Within our non-procurement documents that we've been discussing in previous videos, the closest document to that would be the project scope statement. That would be the closest equivalent. And the other document is referred to as the request for proposal, or RFP. And this one describes the process that the prospective sellers will use to submit their proposal to us. So it's not talking about the product we want, that's in the statement of work. It's describing how they will produce the information and documentation, and which is the proposal, so that we may potentially select them. And there's a lot of complication to that. Now, there are other, we're talking in this video lecture completely about RFPs. Just for full information, there are other types of documents for certain types of procurements. For example, there is something referred to as a request for information, or an RFI. Now, as the name implies, we're looking for information to be provided, perhaps to make another decision further down the road. So an RFI is one that can be used. Another is a request for quote, RFQ, which is similar to an RFP. You can think of an RFP would be one for perhaps a more complex variable type of procurement where there's different options and so on. So that would normally be an RFP. And an RFQ would be one where would it be for more, say, standard materials that have less variability. So we're more looking for a quote, which is a more defined sort of proposal, as opposed to an RFP, which is a more open-ended type of proposal. So just FYI, there are various types of secondary documents similar to the request for proposal, but for our purpose, we're going to be looking at RFPs for the remainder of this lecture. Okay, let's go to our video, and we'll now look at the process that will be used during this point where we are defining the procurement. So let's watch this together.
With the decision to procure the multimedia demo from outside the organization, Sophie begins to develop two new documents, the statement of work and the request for proposal. Sophie knows that the procurement process, especially for large procurements, can be a complex process. She finds that it is often advisable to seek out assistance from those with procurement expertise. At Deco Productions, they are usually found in the purchasing, supply chain, or logistics areas of the organization. She knows it is also important to obtain legal assistance, particularly at the point when the contract is created. So, in order to have a successful procurement process, Sophie negotiates the assistance of representatives from the supply chain and logistics department and the legal department. She asks each of the representatives to review her documentation and provide advice throughout the procurement process. Given the amount of planning work that has been performed, creating the statement of work is fairly straightforward. Using the WBS and project scope statement as a guide, she describes the key features of the multimedia demo in detail. To ensure the demo is ready by the product launch date, May 8th, she is very specific about the due date for the work. She also includes a number of technical requirements in the special requirements section of the statement of work. At the same time that she begins to work on the statement of work, she starts to work on the RFP. Looking at the project schedule, she selects April 10th as the date that proposals must be submitted. The proposal itself should provide a description of the proposed multimedia demo, a cost estimate, and a list of key milestones, including the final delivery date. She indicates that the contract for this procurement will require a fixed price meaning that the seller guarantees the price and it will not change. Sophie also develops the criteria that will be used to select the winning proposal. Deco Productions is known for the reliability of its products, so she sets quality as the highest requirement. Though not as important as quality, her project has a fairly tight budget, so the cost of the demo is set as the second criteria. Sophie has always found that a seller's reputation is important, so she makes this the third factor. This results in the following criteria: professional quality, 50%, cost, fixed price, 30%, seller reputation, 20%. Deco Productions has a standard legal contract template for this type of work. Sophie includes this template as an appendix. And finally, she adds the statement of work as a second appendix. Reading through the RFP and statement of work documentation, she feels confident that prospective sellers will have the information they need to submit a proposal. Now, on to the next step: creating the list of prospective sellers who will receive these documents.
Okay, so through that video, the process of defining the procurement was demonstrated, and there's a lot that happens at that stage. Very active in terms of the buying organization is very busy on the creation of these documents. So as we saw in the video, to assist with the completion of the procurement documents, Sophie enlists the support of representatives from the supply chain and logistics department and legal department. And that often is the case. Procurement has a very set process that needs to be followed, especially for large procurements. And so bringing in expertise from individuals like this that could be in a supply chain department or a purchasing department and so on is a very helpful person to advise for a large procurement. Also, because of the existence of a legal contract that we will see a little bit in a few minutes, representatives of your legal department, or if an organization doesn't have a legal department, of a lawyer brought in on retainer and so on, to ensure that the contract is set up effectively. So that's something that's done. The statement of work and request for proposal, both of these documents are produced, and these can be significant efforts. They're in order for sellers to quote, they need a great amount of details, particularly on large or complex procurements. So it is often a significant effort to take this documentation. Now, again, much of it is from work that would be done in the planning phase, the requirements definition, the creation of the work breakdown structure, project scope statement, and so on, can all be used as references and input into these documents. So you can see examples of a sample statement of work and RFP for the case study in the textbook, chapter 14. So key idea: in order to communicate the requirements of a procurement, a statement of work and an RFP should be produced and sent to prospective sellers. Okay, on to our next step, which is to choose the seller. And the first step within that is to identify prospective sellers, is that we have to find them. So we need to locate, well, who in the market is able to provide this type of good or service to our company. Now, there are various approaches that are defined, and the textbook describes some of those. But you can, just from an overview, you can, use your background knowledge and so on. There are colleagues or consultants that can be used to locate the prospective sellers, and there are often published lists of sellers for certain types of industries and so on. So there's many different sources that are possible. And again, advised to check out this section in the textbook. A word of note that for public projects, those that are the when the government organizations are the buyer, it's very important that this is a public process, that this is not done in secret, or only certain companies are selected. It needs to be published in a publication that anyone has access to. So there are additional rules around this for public organizations like governments and so on, that are needed, or that are required. So that's something that's an additional requirement. So key idea: identify prospective sellers and and then when they are identified and selected and as potential sellers that we want to potentially do business with, the next is we also send the procurement documents, the statement of work and the RFP, to them. So that's sort of the last step of the choosing this or at this step of choosing the seller. The next step though is to evaluate the proposals. Once we send them the RFP and statement of work, those organizations have the option of sending us a proposal or not. They don't have to. Hopefully some will, by the due date and in the format that we defined in the RFP. So after a period of time, we should be receiving a number of those proposals. So as indicated here, the identified sellers now determine whether they will submit a proposal. And there are various approaches that can be taken to evaluate proposals. And those are, again, that's something that is covered in detail in the textbook. But there can be presentations, there can be site visits to the organization. We can also use weighted evaluation tools to be able to assess each of the proposals on different criteria in order to come up with a weighted average and help us make the decision, or help the buyer make the decision, because it is such a key decision to make. So overall key idea: the buyer needs to evaluate the proposals received in order to choose a seller to complete the procurement. The next step is, once a seller is selected, once we have made the decision of which one to proceed with, the next step is to create the contract. So this is a legal contract between the buyer and seller. Now, again, the key question is, well, what type of information would be contained in a contract? And again, this is covered in detail in the textbook, but some ideas of, well, a lot of the information that is contained in the statement of work and the RFP are brought over into the contract, those that are agreed upon. There may be other terms and conditions. There may be certain milestones that need to be met, the payment schedule of when that will take place, how changes will be processed, and a dispute mechanism if there are disagreements, how those will be resolved. Those and more are contained in a contract, which again is the reason why a lawyer is certainly involved in a large procurement. And that's why this takes a significant amount of time. A contract is not something, again, on a significant procurement, is not something that is just necessarily created instantly. It will take time and negotiation between the buyer and the seller. It's very important as it defines the work to be completed and is used to resolve any disputes during the procurement. If there becomes a dispute between the buyer and seller, two different organizations, it's the contract that will be used to settle that dispute. Ultimately, if it had to go to a court, the judge would look at the contract. So there is an incredible focus put on this document because it guides the rest of the procurement. Everything is according to the contract. So a key document, not one that should be done, necessarily quickly and without deep thought. So key idea: create the contract with the seller or between the buyer and the seller in order for the procurement work to begin. Okay, so let's look at our next video, which is on this topic that we've been covering, which is choosing the seller. So we'll watch this together.
Sophie puts the finishing touches on the statement of work document and saves it on her laptop. Now that she has completed the documentation of the procurement requirements, her mind turns to the challenge of finding an organization to complete the work. Sophie understands the importance of taking care when selecting a seller, as whatever they accomplish during the project will reflect, either positively or negatively, on the project team and Deco Productions. She knows from experience that customers will hold her accountable for the quality of the final product regardless of who actually performed the work. From personal experience, Sophie knows of one company that could perform the job. After making phone calls to her colleagues, she adds 2 more companies to the list. And finally, after an online search, she finds a few more companies that look promising. After locating the addresses of each of the potential sellers, Sophie sends the RFP and statement of work to each company. They now have until the due date defined in the RFP to reply with a proposal. As the April 10th deadline approaches, a number of proposals arrive. Sophie looks through the options and weighs the pros and cons of each. After a period of time, she picks her top 3 proposals from Cityscape Inc., Design View Video, and TDR Online. In preparation for the selection of the winning proposal, Sophie organizes an evaluation committee consisting of Arun, the project sponsor, Fatijit, the business analyst, and herself. Sophie also calls each of the references provided in the proposals. Sophie knows that talking a good game in a proposal is easy, but a satisfied customer who is willing to be used as a reference is a much greater indicator of future success. Glancing at her watch and realizing it's time for the evaluation meeting, Sophie gathers the proposals and heads to the meeting room. She writes the evaluation criteria previously developed: professional quality, cost, and seller reputation on a flip chart. She then goes around the table asking each person to provide a ranking from 1 to 10 for each. Once the ranking is complete and the results are compiled in a spreadsheet, Design View Video emerges as the clear winner. Following the meeting, Sophie contacts Design View Video to inform them that they have been selected for the project. During the discussion, she indicates that she'll send the contract to them shortly. Over the next few days, both parties make a number of adjustments to the contract. After a final review, both parties sign the contract, and the work is now ready to begin.
Okay, so throughout that video, I think you saw the various aspects that we had previously discussed took place. So there are lots of things that happen throughout that process, the culminating in the writing of the contract, which then the work may commence at that point. So once the contract is defined, then the seller begins to do the work according to the terms of the contract, and that will take a period of time. Now, the buyer is not doing nothing at this point. They're not idle. They have a role in this process. Now, probably not as much work the seller is doing on for this procurement, likely the majority of work and effort is within the seller organization, but the buyer has a role of monitoring the seller's performance. Once the contract has been created, the seller begins work on the project deliverables. As we mentioned, the buyer needs to monitor the progress of the work being performed. This can be done through a status reporting process or some sort of communication of progress that is coming from the seller to the buyer. There might be site visits and so on. There's probably various meetings and reports and so on. So that's defined as part of the communication plan for the procurement. The buyer needs to verify the deliverables as they are produced and as defined in the contract. Right, the contract would be should be defining all of this in terms of how the progress of the work will be monitored, how the buyer will verify the deliverables, at what points they will receive them, and the buyer needs to manage issues and changes that may occur during this procurement, just like other projects that we've discussed in previous video lectures. Issues are going to arise. There may be problems that occur. There are certain things that the seller is not able to do, which will be issues. There's also potential changes that may come up or may be suggested, by from the buyer in terms of new requirements, or from the seller in terms of perhaps changes that they propose based on the work that they're doing. So similarly to previous video lectures, a change control process will be needed throughout this. And that's something that happens during this part of the procurement of monitoring the seller's performance. As mentioned previously, the contract is very important. It defines the work and is used to resolve disputes during the procurement. There's various methods that can be used to resolve disputes. And again, these are covered and discussed in detail in the textbook, but just a quick summary of it. For example, the number one thing, if there's disputes between the buyer and seller, negotiation, discussion, and some collaboration is the first thing. Is that normally that is used and employed and hopefully covers most contract disputes. But there's some resolution that is done between buyer and seller without anyone getting involved. It can if needed, go to mediation, which involves a mediator, and the mediator just helps bring the two parties together. It's like a third party that will advise each group, try to come up with a solution with the two parties, but doesn't have the ability to enforce a solution. It can also, in some cases, go to arbitration. Again, the parties would have to agree to that and so on. The two parties, the buyer and seller. And in that case, through the arbitration, the arbiter has the ability to enforce a solution based on their assessment of the contract dispute. And finally, the most significant or the I guess the ultimate would be litigation, where it is actually taken to court. One party is in effect suing the other for breach of contract, and it goes to a court, and a judge decides. Now that's the least desirable. It's very costly and so on. And that's why there's this graduated approach, and hopefully in most cases the negotiation, which is the least expensive and least costly. If you're in litigation, that means the procurement really isn't going to, the procurement is in all likelihood unsuccessful at that point. So that's not something you want to do. So overall key idea, monitor the performance of the seller. Once it is complete and approved, the contract is closed, ending the procurement. So that's the end of this video lecture. There's some key terminology that's involved there. Some new terms: buyer, contract, make or buy analysis, request for proposal, seller, and statement of work. Procurement has its own terminology, which is a little different from regular project management, but it's something that is used because of the procurement processes that are used. And again, you can see a list of the key terminology in Chapter 14. Some of the references used during this video lecture, and this is the end of this topic.